Good morning, everyone. Welcome to UNU-INWEH Science Talk. In this Science Talk, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rene Obringer, Research Fellow, Urban and Interdependent Infrastructure Systems. Dr. Rene's research interests focus on understanding and evaluating the impact of climate change on urban systems, with an emphasis on water and energy. More broadly, Sharon's methods from data science, climatology, and civil engineering to study the nexus between climate change, people, and urban systems. At UNU-INWEH, she investigates climate change, impacts and adaptation strategies for complex systems involving large-scale renewable energy generation, hydropower system, multi-use reservoir, and water electricity beyond nexus. Besides UNU-INWEH, Dr. Rene is an assistant professor in the Department of Energy and Mineral Engineering at Penn State University. During this talk, please post a question in the Q&A. The science talk will be recorded. All our science talks are hosted on our YouTube channel, and details are posted on our websites. With this, I would like to welcome Dr. Rene. Over to you.
All right. Thank you for having me. I'm Renee. I'm an assistant professor at Penn State. And today I'm going to talk about some recent work that we've been doing focused on water availability in the Western US, specifically looking at how demand management policies might sort of behave or how effective they might be under climate change. And so a brief sort of outline of what I'm going to go over. I'm going to start by sort of giving a very broad overview of the background and methods that I used in this study, and then focus in on our case study in the Western US, and wrap up with a summary and practical implications. And so the motivation for this work largely stems from the most, or at least in 2022, the recent IPCC report, looking at sort of potential future climate realizations. And so in this case, the sort of best case scenario that they projected down here, C1, it never actually leads us to drop below 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So even if we were to stop all fossil fuel production and burning today, we've sort of already gotten this ball rolling enough that we won't see a return to what we would consider normal, at least in this century. And so a lot of my work then focuses on this idea that even under the best case scenario, we still need to adapt to climate change, and trying to figure out how our infrastructure will function in those sort of future adverse scenarios. And so this talk focuses on water, and specifically water in the West, and some of the implications that we've already begun to see from climate change. We're seeing increased droughts, and this has been a phenomena that's happened in the Western US for centuries. It is a drier climate, and so they end up with droughts. But we've also started to see these droughts in places that haven't previously had extreme water issues, such as New York City, New Jersey, even leading to mandated water reductions in the East Coast, which has previously been basically unheard of. And to the point where after Hurricane Helene a few years ago, every state except 2 were actually considered to be in drought within the US. And so we sort of, where I am from in Pennsylvania, tend to think of drought as a Western US problem within the context of the US, or somewhere away from where we are, because we sort of have generally wet springs and summers, but that sort of is starting to change, and we're starting to see this idea of demand management popping up in places that it hasn't in the past. And so a lot of utilities and management agencies have sort of zeroed in on water demand management as a means to improve water availability, particularly in times of shortage, because we could try to find more water sources, but that's not always possible. So we could think about desal or large cross-country transfers, but that's not really practical and feasible or even cost-effective in many places. And so this finding new water is a struggle across a lot of the areas that are facing these droughts. And so during times of shortage, then the water utilities, management agencies, et cetera, will often focus on these short-term reductions to try to just manage sort of reactively as the drought goes on by changing prices or mandating reductions. And these are often effective in the short term, particularly if you have a sort of good communication strategy around why these reductions are happening. But then what we see often is that once the shortage period is over, there's a big rebound effect because now suddenly people are using water, occasionally using more water than they were even before the drought happened. And so when we're thinking about long-term changes, a lot of management agencies, governments, utilities, et cetera, are starting to try to look at how they can encourage long-term conservation as a way to manage their water availability, even outside of those emergency periods. So being a little bit more proactive. And sort of what we wanted to look at in this study is whether or not those long-term policies are going to be effective under extreme climate change. And so we focused this study on 3 cities in the US, the Western US, that are all connected to the Colorado River Basin. So we have Denver in the upper basin, Las Vegas and Phoenix in the lower basin. And so all of these cities rely on water from the Colorado River, which is heavily allocated and managed, one of the most sort of managed systems in the US, where you can withdraw a certain amount of water and then they cap it, and there's a very complex legal system around there. And so what we're trying to look at is sort of in these cities that are experiencing extreme drought and also have very limited access to increasing supply, they're very much focused on demand management. So how will they fare in the future? And so to actually do this work, we built an agent-based model, but it happened in 4 main steps. The first step was that we conducted a survey. And so this survey was conducted in 2018, 2019, with residents in the 3 cities. And the survey itself was very broadly focused on climate change adaptation. But because these cities are in a very drought-prone area with very limited water resources, they actually focused most of their questions on droughts and water conservation in general. So we were able to use this survey that was collected to further investigate these demand management techniques. And so we took that survey and we ran it through an unsupervised learning algorithm to try to develop these archetypes of attitudes towards water conservation. And so ultimately this ended up looking like a very complex node structure where we sort of were able to identify survey respondents regardless of the city that they lived in that answered the questions in the survey related to drought and water conservation very similarly. And so we were able to classify those and ultimately ended up with 7 key archetypes of how people in these cities felt about water conservation. And so this first part was published in Water Resources Management in 2023. And so it sort of is the starting point of understanding these attitudes towards conservation. And after that, we took those attitudes and integrated them into the agent-based model. And so to do that, we collected stream flow data, we collected weather data, and we collected this water consumption data from the 3 cities, integrated them into a large agent-based model, which is open access if people are interested. And the result of this model is then a prediction of the water storage in the city as a function of these inputs, basically just solving the water balance equation. We've got precipitation coming in, we've got stream flow coming in, we've got water use sort of leaving the system, we've got evaporation leaving the system. So very much focused on just solving this water balance. And this initial development was published in 2024 and focused primarily on Phoenix as just a way to test to see if we could integrate these all of these data sources to adequately model the storage in the region. And then sort of what I'm going to talk about most today is the step where we actually integrated demand management and climate change into this model. And so to do this, we sort of took away the observed water use and put in some hypothetical demand management scenarios based on our archetypes, basically saying if we develop a more participatory water use model in Phoenix or in Las Vegas or in Denver, does that, if more people are participating in conservation programs, if more people are aligning themselves with a pro-conservation attitude, does that actually have a long-term effect on the storage? And then we also took away our observations and replaced those with climate change scenarios, specifically using the CMIP5 scenarios, which had the greatest data availability for our region of interest. And this most recent paper was published late last year in Water Resources Research. And so throughout the talk, I'm sort of going to start talking briefly about these attitudes just to provide the background, but mostly I'm going to focus on this later ABM. And so to jump in to the research questions, the first question that we were wanting to answer in that first paper is what are the archetypes of consumer attitudes towards conservation? So is there a difference between somebody who is actively participating in a conservation program put on by their city versus somebody who doesn't care about water conservation? Like, can we tell that there is a difference in how they responded to our survey? And so in this case, this is that first half of the modeling process where we took survey data and developed through this unsupervised learning to identify archetypes. And so the primary input to this part of the study was the survey data that was conducted in 2018. And so there were 3,000 surveys sent through mail across the 3 cities with a 28% response rate. If you're familiar with social science work, this is pretty standard. There isn't a huge, you don't expect to have a very high response rate in terms of just how people are busy and not always interested in filling out these surveys. But as I mentioned, the questions touched on water management strategies, climate change, personal knowledge and responsibility for water conservation, and awareness of drought management plans, conservation programs, things like that. And ultimately what this result showed through our unsupervised learning method, we found 7 key archetypes that sort of showed people that answered questions in the same way. And then we gave these archetypes some descriptive names based off of their responses. And so we have a neutral archetype that just sort of answered in the middle of all these questions. Most of the questions are saying 1 to strongly disagree, 5 to strongly agree. And so these people were sort of just sitting at 3 in the middle. So they're sort of just neutral. We had the individualist, who was an archetype of people that recognized that droughts and water shortages were a problem in their respective locations, but they also felt that the solution, water conservation, was sort of an individual choice, and they weren't a fan of government mandates to reduce water. And they're sort of paired with the concerned group. They're sort of, if you look at how they answer questions, some of them are the same, but they've got some slight differences in key parts. And the concerned group are people that are, as the name suggests, concerned about the state of their water situation in the city, but they're not quite sure what to do about it. So they're sort of expecting in their responses, they were very pro government action, but not very pro individual action, sort of gave an indication that they just simply didn't know what to do. And so they just thought that maybe the government should handle it. And so those two sort of archetypes are in a little bit opposite. Both are aware of the problem, but different solutions. The other two that sort of go together are would-be participant and the participant. The participant archetype is just a group of people that are actively participating in water conservation programs. They show the most awareness of what's going on in the city, as well as the most support for various options such as water reuse or government mandates. They're sort of for the whole spectrum of demand management. Whereas the would-be participant is also very pro all of this, but they're sort of in this 6A is where they differ, and that question is about personal knowledge or the feeling that they can do something. And so the would-be participant is who we're going to be focusing on in this study, because they're sort of the archetype that is ripe for change, so to speak, because they agree that there is a problem, but they don't feel that they have the personal knowledge to tackle that problem. And so they're sort of that group of people that are really going to be easy to potentially reach and demonstrate and provide a skill set for how they can participate in these conservation programs. We also find confident denier and disengaged, and these are our more negative views of conservation. Either they don't believe in it at all, or they simply aren't aware of really any problem in the area. And so, like I said, we'll be focusing primarily on the would-be participant, and if it's possible to shift their mindset, and if that's successful, does that actually have an impact on demand management? And so, like I said, they're sort of a good group potential for conversion, so to speak, but they also represent a pretty big chunk across all of our cities. So this is the percent of respondents that fell into each of the archetypes. And so nearly over a quarter of all respondents in each city fall into this would-be participant, which is great because that means there's a large chunk of people that want to be more active in their conservation programs, but simply don't know how. And that's sort of the easiest group to reach compared to potentially the individualist group that sees a problem but sees that sort of they shouldn't be told what to do, that they should just, every individual should make that choice, or the confident denier that simply doesn't even see that there's a problem. So again, we'll be sort of focusing on this green group to see if sort of making that switch and trying to get that group to be more participatory, since they're sort of set up to do that. And so once we had these archetypes set up, we set out to really answer two main questions. The first was, how would changing consumer attitudes impact water availability, just straight by itself? And we sort of talk about this a lot in that second research paper. But the main thing I'm going to talk about today is if those patterns of attitudes impacting availability, if they hold under climate change. And so basically thinking about if we were to successfully change a quarter of all residents' attitudes towards conservation so that they were using less water on a day-to-day basis, would that actually have a noticeable impact under climate change? So we sort of have this demand management is a good thing, but sort of testing, is it enough under these extreme scenarios? And so to jump in to this sort of second paper, in this case, this is when we started to build the agent-based model. And so we're sort of trying to predict the water storage, and we're only looking at surface storage. And so a lot of these cities are primarily surface, but there is an option to do groundwater in sort of an emergency case. We weren't including that in our analysis because they tend to not want to use the groundwater anyway. It's sort of their like savings account that they consider the groundwater to be available in an emergency, but they try really hard not to use it. And so we're sort of just focusing on the storage here. And then our water balance equation, we considered stream flow in and out, collected directly for the reservoir, precipitation over the reservoir, but also in the catchment area to calculate runoff, evaporation from the reservoir itself. And then we did water consumption, which we have real consumption values that we mapped to our archetypes and then fit that to the larger population. And so the results of that fitting are shown here, where we ended up using a gamma distribution as the way to best fit real consumption values. And so for the most part, this fits. Las Vegas is sort of, Denver is like a really good demonstration of a gamma distribution, which tends to have a very long skew to the right. But most of them were still doing quite well. And so we decided to use the gamma compared to the Weibull or log normal, which we also tested. And then we have losses, which is a calculated term to basically account for the fact that if we're storing water in reservoirs, some of it is going to percolate into the groundwater. And so there could also be positive transfers if the water table is really high. And so that's what this sort of losses is considered. It is primarily a reduction due to just general loss into soil. But we do see in some cases the model actually predicts an increase. It's kind of like a catch-all to try to balance this water consumption or water balance equation. And so here, our research goal was then to develop that ABM. And so as a reminder of what our methods looked like, we took our stream flow in and out, our hydrological conditions, our meteorological conditions in the region, and our fitted water consumption, built an ABM, got a prediction of the storage by solving that water balance, and then replaced it with demand management scenarios, primarily focused on changing those attitude archetypes, and also with climate change. And again, in this case, we focused on an ensemble of 4 GCMs, but also did all 4 RCPs in the CMIP-5 sort of iteration of the general climate models. And so we've got very low warming, very high warming, and the stuff in the middle. And so to jump in to the results, we have our observed baseline. And so when we started this model, we had all the observations. And so we wanted to see how well the model actually fit the real data. And so here, what we see is the black line is the actual storage that we observed. The light gray lines are the red dashed line is the actual storage. The light gray lines are of the 100 different model runs that we did to allow for some randomization in the model itself. And the black line is the average of those 100 models. And so we can see that there are some patterns standing out. And first, if we look at Denver, our sort of modeled red line is fitting our modeled black line is fitting our actual red line pretty well until about 2013. And then the actual storage does better than what the model is predicting. And so we're sort of underestimating the storage. And essentially what happens here in 2013 is that there's a major drought in Denver across a lot of Colorado. And the city actually integrated or sort of went into their drought protocol where they mandated reductions, actually did demand management. And in our baseline, we're not actually considering any demand management. We're just sort of looking at the straight water balance and trying to see if the water consumption as we fit it, if that fits into the water balance. And so we do see this sort of separation here. And so when we went back and did the scenario testing, that was sort of our motivation for including some more demand management based off droughts, because it's very clear that the city was able to maintain storage pretty well, whereas our model is showing that it's being reduced heavily during that drought and never really catches back up. We see in Las Vegas, sort of the model in the opposite. It's following the pattern very well. It's just sort of over predicting just a little bit. And so we sort of, the uncertainty here though is very small in terms of the bands. A lot of the 100 model runs were very similar in Las Vegas, despite adding sort of forcing randomization in there to try to get some perturbations. And then in Phoenix, we see something similar where we're following the patterns very well, but then we end up just sort of under predicting in this case. And again, this was without any demand management at all, just basically saying that if people always used water the way that was sort of fitted based off of our data, this is sort of what the water balance would show. But obviously people are changing how they use water throughout this time period in response to sort of top-down mandates, but also potentially through other existing programs. And so this was sort of just a starting point for our analysis. And so then once we had that baseline, the sort of measure of error is actually not terrible for any of these. And so we moved forward with this, the caveat that we were going to integrate more demand management to try to get a little bit more accuracy. And so then what we did was implement the climate change scenarios. So we took that same model with the water balance and sort of forced it with future data from 2006 through 2100. So the full suite or the full length of the time series in the CMIP5 models. And basically we can see how the different scenarios are going. And so RCP 8.5 is the darkest, RCP 2.6 is sort of the lightest yellow. And so we can see that in Denver, and the dashed lines here are sort of the first quantile, median, and third quantile of the historical storage values. And so we can see that in our model, because we ran the historical data set as well, so from 1970 through 2006, that historical data set actually picks up where the storage was higher than it was generally in our historical period, but we can see that it starts to drop. But that most of the time, the climate scenarios for Denver and for Las Vegas are fairly stable until mid-century, and then we start to see a little bit more separation, whereas towards the end of the century, RCP 8.5 is seeing a pretty significant reduction in both Denver and Las Vegas, as well as in Phoenix down here. Interestingly, we also see similar RCP 2.6, the most mild climate change scenario, is sort of a lower value end of century than the middle two climate scenarios, but still well within that sort of typical range of data. And so, whereas with Las Vegas, all the other sort of mild climate change scenarios end up roughly where they are, with RCP 8.5 being reduced. And again, so this was just basic climate change with some drought mandates included. So looking at if the storage volume dropped below a certain threshold, the city would enact certain stages of managing their demand from a top-down approach. And so even with that, we're still seeing these significant reductions in storage, which would play out into water availability, because sort of at some point you can't keep reducing, mandating consumption. And so the next step and sort of the final piece of this was to look at those attitude-based demand management policies. So if we could shift from our baseline archetypes into that more participatory view, how would that actually impact the water consumption under climate change? And so those results are shown here in this plot. And so again, we've got our quantile and our median and our third quantile. And the black box plot is the range of storage for the entire timeline under the baseline attitudes or archetypes. And the blue is under the more participatory archetypes. So basically encouraging all of those would-be participants to turn into full participants. So give them the tools so that they feel confident in water conservation and are actively participating in the programs. And so we can see that in some cases, such as Denver, we're actually looking at improvements under extreme climate change because people have adopted these long-term plans. And so basically what we're seeing is that if we can successfully change attitudes towards conservation, there's a pretty good chance that we're not only going to maintain our water availability under extreme change, we actually might have some improvements in the situation, at least in Denver. And if you sort of recall, Denver has a huge amount of would-be participants and the least amount of participants. So it's not totally surprising that they have the most growth or the most potential to have an influence by encouraging a more participatory government or participatory view of water conservation compared to the other cities that are already have a significant portion of participants. And so then we see in Las Vegas, we see some similar movement in RCP 8.5 and in Phoenix. But under the sort of moderate climate change, we're actually seeing some decreases, meaning that under certain realizations, even if climate change is sort of mitigated and we end up on a more moderate trajectory, under certain realizations, that still might not be enough. So this could be a climate scenario where there was just a really prolonged drought in the climate models that occurred during RCP 6.0, but not 8.5 in this case. And so we're basically seeing that some decreases here and here, as well as under Phoenix. And so in the lower basin, adding more participation is good, and it helps maintain some stability in their water availability compared to the baseline, but it might not be sort of the catch-all improvement, and they might need to think about more creative solutions to try to sort of manage this sort of difficulty with climate change, reducing water availability, and not being able to keep up solely by demand management. And so to summarize, we sort of found with our first paper that promoting these conservation attitudes can lead to improved water availability, but under extreme or even moderate climate change, these reductions are not always enough. And so even though it is good to reduce our demand, we can't solely rely on that to solve the water availability problems that we have. And basically that certain climate realizations through our climate modeling can lead to reductions in surface water availability that often potentially can outpace the improvements from reducing demand. And so we might still end up in this situation where we're consistently in a water shortage, even though we have tried to reduce the demand as much as we can. And so some practical implications, especially in the Colorado River, which, if you don't know, is currently undergoing a renegotiation of the allocations for all the states and countries, because Mexico is also involved in that discussion about who gets allocated how much water. And it's a very complex legal situation, but just some practical implications that we can think about as we go through those discussions is that demand reduction is still important. We do see significant improvement from encouraging long-term attitude shifts in reducing our water demand, which is good all around. But it's important to remember that this is not a catch-all. It's not something that is going to solve all the problems. And so there's still a need for continued efforts to not only mitigate climate change, to try to reduce those potential impacts, but also adapt to these climate-induced supply reductions, either through increased water reuse or improved interstate, inter-country relations to try to actually ensure that water is passing all the way through the river and that everybody has access to enough for a sustainable future. But also it's important to remember that not all climate change realizations will have the same impact. And so we had 4 models, and each of those we took the ensemble of, but each of those iterations is sort of making a different projection based off of its internal assumptions. And so making sure that we recognize that some climate models are going to potentially have a fairer outlook than others, but making sure that we're aware that these are at its core still projections and that we need to acknowledge the uncertainty in those as well. And finally, cross-boundary coordination is really critical for maintaining the supply. We can see that Denver has the potential to really see significant improvements due to demand management. But if they were to enact this, they also need to be working with the cities and utilities in the lower basin to make sure that Denver isn't just pulling their full allocation and saving it for later at the expense of Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Mexico down the line. And so really encouraging cross-boundary coordination in acknowledgement that some cities might win, so to speak, while others might lose, and we can work together to make sure everybody has enough water. And so with that, thank you for joining. Just a shout out to my collaborator, Dave White at Arizona State, and an undergrad student, Grace Peterson, who helped a lot with the data collection for this most recent paper. And so with that, we can open up to questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Operator, for such nice presentation that relates our climate science to complex human behavior. I think this would be a great way to for the policymakers on how to target people for their management of water resources. So you identified 7 different archetypes from disengagement to confident participants, and then also there are confident denial. So what would be your strategy for people bringing from disengagement to at least participation level?
Mm-hmm.
And do you also find that for the confident denial, do you even target them? Either peer pressure or social proof, those.
Yeah. So I think that the disengaged group would be easier to reach. We did a deeper dive into the respondents that fell into this category, and some of the demographic questions that were asked in the survey were about income, how long they had lived in the area, sort of education, things like that, renting versus owning a house, just basic demographics. And the disengaged group were primarily recent sort of people that had recently moved to the area within the last few years. And they also tended to be lower income and renters. And so we think that this disengaged group, likely they haven't lived in the area for very long, so they might not even be aware of the problems that have been ongoing or the programs that exist because they just moved. But they also are lower income and renting, which gives them less agency to participate in some of these programs because they're not in a position to change out their toilet for a low flow option, or to completely update their landscaping or stuff like that. And so we think that the disengaged group, though, could be very easily sort of brought in to a more participatory fold through sort of just like information sessions and providing the knowledge of what can be done for sort of cheap and renting options, so stuff that doesn't require a huge amount of change, basically. And so the disengaged group, probably a little bit more easy to access. The confident deniers are interesting. And their responses are these right in here, 6A, 6B, and 5A. So 6A and 6B are about personal knowledge and responsibility for conservation. And so that's why our would-be participant has a fairly high ranking on personal responsibility, that's 6B, but not on personal knowledge, that's 6A.
I think you have to bring her slide on because she's referring to
Oh.
her slide. No, we can't.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm on slide 11.
No, you're okay.
Okay.
Martin on his end had yeah.
Oh, okay.
We're back.
Sorry.
We can see your slide, so don't worry.
But yeah, so the confident deniers, they rate themselves, they're almost the highest rating for personal knowledge and personal responsibility for water conservation, but the lowest rating for is there a problem? And so they don't actually believe that there is a need to conserve water, but they believe that if there was that need, that they would be able to do it very successfully. And so this group is luckily the smallest, or one of the smallest in all three cities, and they would be very difficult to actually reach and to encourage more participation, because you're not fighting against lack of knowledge, you're fighting against decided ignorance of climate change, basically. That droughts are getting worse, that water shortage is a problem in their cities, that they need to care about it. And so that is a whole other area of study to try to not just convince these people to conserve water, but to convince them that there is a reason to do so, that climate change is real and that water shortages are a problem. So they're a little bit more difficult to reach, I think, than the disengaged group.
Thank you. So is there a limit of individual behavior? Because you have also mentioned that at some climate scenario, the demand management wouldn't work. So could you mention a kind of like tipping point where individual behavior doesn't matter?
Yeah, so in our larger studies, and I don't know if I have that. Yeah. So before we actually just locked in on converting the would-be participants to participants, we did some other studies. And basically, one of them that we did was converting the confident deniers into individualistic archetypes, because the individualistic archetypes still participate in water conservation. They just don't agree with the government mandates. And so with the confident denier being somebody that believes they have the knowledge to conserve water, the way that you would actually try to convince them would be to talk to them about it being an individual sort of choice, an individual option that they would make, but something that they could do on their own, sort of try to give them that like agency, basically. And so we did a test to say, if we convert all the confident deniers into the individualistic group, what does that do? And basically we see no significant changes. So we were converting them, but nothing was really happening. We also tried to convert them into concerned. So maybe if we managed to change their minds about droughts and climate change, and again, there wasn't any significant change. And we think it's because there's such a small proportion of people in these cities that trying to change their attitudes just didn't provide any noticeable impact on the water storage in general. But if we looked at other cities, if we were able to do this survey and then do the archetype analysis at a larger scale, I'm guessing that we would see more frequent confident deniers sort of out east, maybe in the south of the US, where water issues haven't really become a big deal. And so we might see more confident deniers of people saying that, well, it's not an issue. I don't care about that, but I could do it if I needed to. And then in that case, we might actually see an improvement if we could encourage them to participate more. But yeah, so basically we see that there's this really significant change. Even if you were to look at the sort of significance values here, this is a jump that is fairly significant, going from partial participation to full participation.
Thank you. On the cross-border issues, how did you observe people relate their behavior with the issues on the other state outside their state? And are they ready to change their behavior on that issue?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Are they ready to change their own behavior to relate in the problem with the other state, not their own state?
Yeah, we didn't look into that. And so there is a bit of a, not like a competition, but there is a bit of resentment in the lower basin for the people in the upper basin. And so Denver is sort of drawing water from the very rich area of the Colorado headwaters, and then Las Vegas and Phoenix kind of have to get what's left. And then there's another whole issue with California. And so I think that we didn't look into seeing if we could convince other like people in Denver they should care about what happens to people in Phoenix. But that would be a whole other study to see what the sort of altruistic views are and if people are willing to do something for the greater good of a person that lives 500 miles away.
Thank you. So I have a question from Mia.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting presentation. I know this is outside the scope of your study, but I'm just interested to hear your thoughts about the transferability of these archetypes. And if you were to look at this either in the Delaware River Basin, for example, or with a different type of conservation, say energy conservation instead of water conservation, how that might look.
Yeah, I think so I think that the archetypes might actually be somewhat transferable. So we really did try to I think I can actually pull up the survey questions. We really did try to make them somewhat transferable and not specific to the basin. The questions themselves were very general. And so basically asking about to what extent would you support working with local managers, so being more participatory. And so I think that in terms of other water basins, I think these archetypes could be transferable. We would probably see a lot more variation in them. And so if I was to pull up this, and so I'm in the Susquehanna River Basin, in, which flows into the Chesapeake. And if I were to guess, we would potentially have a decent amount of would-be participants, but very few people actively participating. And we might have a lot more disengaged that didn't fit the demographics of what we see out west. And so I would guess that we would have a lot more affluent homeowners who are also disengaged in issues surrounding water in this area because we don't experience droughts very frequently. And when they do happen, we're actually currently in a drought warning, I think, right now. If I saw the last, but we did just get some snow, so it's sort of weird. But oftentimes we'll see recommendations for voluntary reductions. So last summer, there was a potential for fire weather in central PA. And so there was like a recommendation that you don't burn things. But there was no mandate because we're not used to having those like intensive top-down approaches. And talking to colleagues who actually work in this area with social issues, oftentimes they will see people disobeying the top-down mandate out of spite. And so somebody that might normally be pro-conservation, if the government comes and says, okay, you can't wash your car every other day or something, then they'll go out and wash their car every single day just to spite the fact that somebody told them what they can't do. It's a very interesting mindset. And so we would probably see a lot more individualists, a lot more disengaged, but maybe a decent amount of would-be participants as well, people that sort of realize that they probably should be doing something, but not knowing how to do that because they've never lived in an area where that was a problem that they had to think about. Yeah, compared to energy, I don't think the archetypes would necessarily go through. Maybe they would, but the questions themselves would have to change. So we might end up with some different groupings, basically.
Thank you.
Thank you for a really good presentation. My question is like, when you presented your modeling process earlier, when you say consumption, does it only like, is it limited to just like household consumption? The reason I'm asking is because like the Colorado River, there must be a lot of industrial manufacturing companies, bottling or beverage companies who makes withdrawal to, in the basin. So were their demand or their requirements considered in the research? And are there policies as well that conservation policies that are being implemented when, if the water level becomes critical for these companies, or say like, if Coke has a bottling company there, they would make huge or volumes of withdrawals from the river. So what are their the requirements, and the storage capacity is also factor, their demands are also, water demand is considered in making those the storage and the policies in the area.
Yeah, that's a great question. We only considered household consumption, but we also only considered the storage that was for, at least in Denver and Phoenix, only the storage owned by the water utilities that primarily service residential areas. In Las Vegas, Lake Mead is the storage, and it's just massive. But yeah, so we only considered household. And in the basin, agriculture is huge and industry is also huge. And so these are competing demands, and the allocation structure of the Colorado River Basin has been a first come, first serve. And so there are farmers in the Colorado River Basin that have a priority to withdraw before the city of Denver. And so They're only on usually like a well or rarely a direct intake. But it is kind of interesting to know that like an individual family that has lived out west since the beginning of the basin compact has a higher priority. So during periods of drought, they get to draw first, and then it sort of continues on down. In practice, the cities have such a high amount of allocation that somebody going before them doesn't really make a difference in terms of just the scale. But the industry is an interesting question, and I haven't looked into how industry sort of fits into the allocation structure. And so I'm not sure if industry has to follow how their permitting works with withdrawing, if they have to actually follow drought mandates, because essentially what happens is that the state will usually sort of go into level 1, level 2, level 3, and it'll be increasingly reduced withdrawal ability. And so they will pair that with an increasingly intense mandate for water reduction. And in some cases, the mandates actually have teeth and they can actually fine people usually. But a lot of times it also is sort of just voluntary and hoping that people comply with the reductions. So yeah, it's a good question about industry. I'm not sure how they actually fit into that structure.
Thank you.
You're over time.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Wendy, for your time.
All right.
And thanks everyone for joining this very interesting science talk, and we invite you for the science talk next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Thank you.